Yeah, I don't mind if it's recorded, but I don't really mind either way.
Yeah, whatever.
Hello.
What? Is that your cat?
Yeah. I have a guest.
Uh-oh.
He wants to learn about degrowth.
Good.
Word.
Where's the cat? I did some cat cartoons with my kids today. Drew some cats.
Nice.
Yeah.
Were they on oil rigs?
Pardon?
On an oil rig? Oh wait,
No,
no,
that was yesterday. No, these kids aren't like that. So, do you want to get started or do you want to give it a couple more minutes? What's the protocol?
Maybe one more minute?
Sure.
Okay, maybe we can just get started now. Maybe actually we can start with introductions of ourselves, and then we can have introductions in the chat, and then I'll give like the background to the presentation. So my name is Michelle. I use she, her pronouns. I am located on unceded and traditional ancestral Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. And I'm an organizer at UBC in Vancouver. Gareth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am Gareth from Western University, which is situated on the land of the Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewak, and Attawandaron peoples, and I study international relations and business. Guy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Guy. I go by here, him. I'm currently located in Waterloo, which is on the Haldeman Tract, land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River, which is traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and also Attawandaron peoples. And I organize with Fossil Free UW and Divest Canada.
Yeah, I'm Evelyn, so I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently located on the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Chippewa people, and the Haudenosaunee, so also known as Toronto, Ontario, and I go to University of Toronto and organize with Divest Canada.
So I think since we're a pretty small group, we can probably have everyone do a quick intro. We were previously thinking doing intros in the chat, but since it's a small group, I think if everyone wants to just quickly share your name, pronouns if you like, and the land you're coming from, and then we'd love to hear like something that you know already about degrowth or something that you don't know. So just to give a sense of like where you're at, is this like a totally new concept for you? Is it something you've heard about before, or are there any specific questions that you have about the concept? Marley, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Marley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently on traditional Kickapoo land, which is colonial Chicago. And I don't really know much. I mean, I'm sure maybe as the presentation goes on, I'll be like, oh, okay, this is kind of what I thought maybe it was. But yeah, just pretty excited to learn because I know y'all are pretty passionate about degrowth, so I'm excited. And I'll pass to Lucy.
Hey everyone, my name is Lucy, she or they pronouns. I am on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. And I have gone to one webinar about degrowth. And we talked about it in a class, but I still am fuzzy on like how to really advocate for it, I guess. And yeah, excited to learn more. And I will pass it to Zahur.
Hey everyone, I'm Zahur. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from Treaty 7 territory right now, colonially called Calgary, Alberta, traditional territory of the Siksika on Niitsitapi territory. So yeah, as far as degrowth, I'm part of Divest Canada, so I know that like the discussions around it happen quite a lot, and I quite enjoy it. I guess I just kind of know that it is that it involves shifting to sort of a new economic system that values different things as opposed to kind of capitalist infinite growth. And I guess I'm kind of interested. One thing I don't really know is kind of like how it fits into kind of like anti-capitalism and just transition kind of more generally. And I'll pass it on to Michelle A.
Hello, I'm Michelle. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from actually the same place as Guy. So he's the one who invited me. What is known as Waterloo, Ontario. And yeah, Zahur, I think, explained it really well. What I know about degrowth is primarily from the environmental ethics side, which is what I'm studying environment at the University of Waterloo. So I know a little bit about sort of alternatives to capitalism, but I'm really interested in how to package it in a way that is more palatable and understandable for people who aren't raging leftists, like people who are very, I guess, like attached to this idea of the status quo. And obviously it's scary to be radical and to think outside of what is currently feasible. So yeah, happy to be here. And I'll pass it on to Mary Stewart.
Hi, folks. Yeah, my name's Mary. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in Ottawa, so on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I'm fairly new to degrowth, but I've begun reading about it, and I joined the sort of Discord group and recently joined another degrowth group in Ottawa. And I mean, just to echo what a lot of other folks have said, I'm interested in like learning more and thinking more about how we can fit sort of current movements into degrowth perspectives and make degrowth kind of more tangible to like a wider range of people. And I'm sorry, I joined a bit late, so I do not know who hasn't gone. / maybe I was the last one.
Gurleen.
Hi everyone, I'm Gurleen and I'm calling in from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the lands of the Tsawwassen, Stalo, Kwantlen, Chemainus, and Musqueam nations. I'm very, very new to degrowth. All I know is that it has something to do with our economy, but other than that, it's a completely new term for me. So I'm excited to just learn more. Jenny, have you gone? Or Lucy?
I think Lucy has. I'm not sure about Jenny. Otherwise, maybe that's everybody at this point.
Cool. So can everyone see the screen, the slides properly? Okay, awesome. Yeah, we will be sharing these after as well as a resource. But thank you all for introducing yourselves. It's like great to see that there's a range of experience with degrowth, and a lot of people are interested in learning more about this and how it can apply directly to the movements that we're working on. And that's exactly what we as organizers are interested in is how can we connect degrowth to our work as divestment organizers. So one second. Just trying to set up my screen so I can see everything. Can you see the screen still? It's okay? Okay.
Yeah, we can still see the title slide.
Okay, cool. As you said, we, Gareth, Guy, Evelyn, and I are all representatives of the Divest Canada Coalition, organizing for our schools to remove their investments from the fossil fuel industry. And so as divestment organizers, we often come up against this tension between using a strategy that's from the capitalist system and our personal or organizational beliefs about capitalism, namely that it is a system incompatible with ecological sustainability and human well-being. We know that climate justice cannot be limited to just shifting investments around within the stock market. We absolutely need revolutionary system change. But we also recognize that collectively, our movements aren't at a point where we can bring down capitalism, unfortunately. So we need to use the tools that are at our disposal now within the current system to mitigate present and future harm. This presentation is our attempt to reconcile our commitment to organizing for investment in the present with our belief that we need a new economic system in the long term. We believe very strongly in the power of organizers being able to hold that vision for the future that we ultimately want to build in sight while using the tools available now to organize for change in the present. And in doing so, we can make sure that our present day work is always getting us closer to that ultimate goal. One of the main conclusions that you'll see from this presentation is that if we are committed to revolutionary climate justice, we cannot ignore the question of reinvestment, i.e., where is the money going if not to fossil fuels? So by calling for a rethinking of where these enormous amounts of money are invested, we can push for a shift in funding to things like reparations, wealth redistribution, community investments, and public investments into social goods such as housing, healthcare, education, and renewable energy. These are all necessary parts of revolutionary climate justice. So we hope that this workshop will provide a nice lead-in to the 2 reinvestment workshops that are coming up after this, and we hope that you will all stick around for those as well. But before diving into degrowth, I also just want to acknowledge that degrowth is not actually a new concept. As Indigenous peoples have been passing down teachings related to the dangers of growth and the importance of living in balance with all human and non-human relations for millennia. This is just what Indigenous peoples have been saying all along. And one example is the story of the Wendigo, which is this horrible monster with an insatiable appetite and never-ending greed. And it's kind of a symbol of the dangers of having an economy like the one that we have now. So I think that's it for the introduction, and I will pass it over to Gareth to explain what degrowth actually is.
Thank you, Michelle. So degrowth is a concept that sort of, the term itself originated in France, and it's a concept that is a bit more popular in Europe and is slowly becoming more common in environmental movements in North America, but it borrows from a language that's much broader that within the tradition of ecological economics, which is a field that's all about creating economies that sort of operate within the biophysical limits of the planet and don't overshoot the various planetary boundaries that make it possible to sustain life on Earth. And degrowth in particular is a movement, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Human Geography, that advocates a sort of gradual downscaling of both production and consumption of goods in order to create more sustainable communities. You also might have heard the term a-growth or degrowth used somewhat interchangeably. And I think that sort of gets at the idea that part of degrowth is, of course, the idea that we need to reduce our material consumption so that we can ease our footprint on the planet. But another thing is that another core element of degrowth is the idea of getting away from this constant obsession with economic growth as the most important criteria of development, and understanding that there's many other elements of well-being that need to be addressed independently of the question of economic growth, which is actually a lot of the time not that relevant. So yeah, degrowth is about creating an economy that respects ecological limits, and then also on a bit more of a fundamental level, or like a philosophical level, really. It's degrowth is sort of about undermining the inherent scarcity mindset of capitalism, or which is the idea that capitalism creates artificial scarcity by creating divisions and enclosing land and privatizing resources that forces people through their position of scarcity to compete for resources instead of sharing. And this is what sort of drives the competition that is at the basis of, the market system. Degrowth proposes separating that and sort of instead invoking a theory of what Jason Hickel calls radical abundance, which is the idea that there is enough for everybody as long as we share what we have and redistribute the wealth that exists in the world in order to make sure that everyone has a decent standard of living. I also just want to emphasize that degrowth is really not about scaling down growth in all countries. It is focused on the global north because we don't want this to be a roadblock for the development of the global south, who have obviously not benefited nearly as much from the economic growth that we've seen over the last 100 years. So it's mostly about making sure that rich Western consumers significantly reduce their own material consumption. Next slide, please. Now I will talk a little bit about why degrowth is sort of necessary from an ecological perspective, which is that the very simple reason is that economic growth tends to drive up energy demand so quickly that it makes it a lot more difficult for the world to actually transition to a clean energy economy in time to avoid significant climate change. And in fact, the existing research has shown that economic growth is currently projected to increase energy demand at a rate that outpaces the rollout of clean energy capacity, which is going to make the clean transition pretty much impossible. The decarbonization of the global economy is not actually currently possible under the existing timelines. The reason is that if global GDP continues to rise at 3% per year, then in order to reach a temperature limit of 1.5 degrees increase, we actually must decarbonize at a rate of 10% per year. But under most policy scenarios, the most optimistic rate of decarbonization is actually only 3%. So without actually significantly downsizing the amount of resources that our economy requires, and also the amount of energy that we consume, we are not going to be able to decarbonize at a rate that will be respectful of ecological limits. And then also quite interestingly is that most low emission scenarios generated by international atmospheric scientists rely on meeting these policy scenarios using speculative negative emissions technologies that have not been invented yet. If they don't use negative emissions technologies, then they tend to be scenarios which involve degrowth. So as you'll see on the next slide, this is a graph from the IPCC report in 2018, where quite significantly for the first time, international scientists included a pathway that they call the low energy demand scenario, which is P1 on this graph, which is the graph that requires a quote downsized energy system to enable rapid decarbonization. All of the other scenarios on this graph, as you can see, have that yellow line, which requires something called BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And that is what is a negative emissions technology, most of which are purely fictional at this point. So for the first time ever, like I guess 3 years ago, the IPCC basically implicitly advocated for degrowth of the global economy. Next slide. Now I'll talk also just a little bit about the differences between degrowth and what a lot of conventional environmentalists call green growth, and this is something that's you hear a lot in Canada. A lot of advocates of so-called green growth say that economic growth can be decoupled from emissions and resource use, and one of the most common reasons that people say that this occurs is because, you know, as our economies shift more towards services, and as resources tend to become increasingly digital, so digital assets through, you know, the internet and stuff like iPods and whatever, iPhones, that will allow us to actually increase or decrease our ecological footprint. The problem is that most of those statistics refer to what is called relative decoupling, which has to do with the resource intensity per unit of GDP. And they tend not to focus on absolute decoupling, which is unfortunately the kind of decoupling that actually matters, which is resource use as a whole. And unfortunately, the absolute decoupling of emissions from GDP or just, you know, resource use in general is actually not occurring at a necessary scale or time frame that would allow us to continue to live within our planetary boundaries. There's a significant number of reasons why decoupling is not happening at the appropriate scale. And this is, if you want to learn more about this, you can actually look at the report by the European Environment Bureau called Decoupling Debunked. But just 3 of the central reasons are listed here. One is the phenomenon of rebound effects, which is when you have, for example, an energy efficiency improvement or saving from some kind of new technology that actually results in cost savings that organizations then reroute into more consumption and more of the same consumption, which actually doesn't really decrease the overall level of impact from a system perspective. There's also cost shifting, which is a very common one where you might see what looks like sort of localized decoupling in any particular region, but if you actually zoom out to the system level, you see that it's really just a reallocation of environmental impacts from rich to poor countries, and this happens a lot in the context of globalization. And then thirdly, there's the idea of problem shifting, which is where solutions to one problem can create new ones that are unanticipated, and this is very common in the history of technology. And then could you go to the next slide, please? This is a graph, just to reiterate the point I was making before. This graph comes from an energy scientist and sociologist named Václav Smil. And the graph, it sort of shows what I was saying, which is that even when relative decoupling occurs on a per unit basis, as you can see here, the absolute number of CO2 emissions has actually continued to rise over the past, 6-7 decades, and it hasn't really shown any signs of abating. So a lot of people talk about, oh, well, our economies are getting cleaner and more efficient. A lot of the time, if you actually deconstruct what people are saying, they're talking about relative emissions. When you look at the overall picture, things tend to look a lot more, it's a lot less clear. But yeah, thank you. That's a basic theoretical introduction to degrowth. And now I'll pass it back to Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview, Gareth. I think that is really great to put everything in perspective. So now that we understand the fundamental problems around growth, I'm going to try to provide some context for where divestment fits in, because I do believe that divestment plays a role in moving us closer to that goal. And in order to do that, we need to talk about fossil fuels and capitalist growth. Fossil fuels have been fundamental to enabling capitalist growth since the Industrial Revolution. And so you can see from this graph here, the enormous increase in energy production that occurred with the addition of coal and then oil and then natural gas to the energy mix. The important thing to notice here is there actually has never been an energy transition. There's only been energy addition. So you can see, for example, coal never actually replaced biomass. It only added on to biomass. The amount of biomass that was used still stayed roughly the same. Similarly, oil never replaced coal. It added on to coal, and they've actually both been growing. And you can see the exact same thing with natural gas being added in on top of oil, with oil still growing, and then with these renewables being added on as well. So it really speaks to Gareth's point about how these new technologies aren't actually replacing fossil fuels, and the whole economy is still growing. So I've also added, I couldn't find a good graph that showed GDP along with energy production, so I've just added this overlay here. So you can kind of see this black line, which shows GDP, and it's really striking, like how similar these curves are, and really illustrates how the addition of fossil fuels into the energy mix facilitated this exponential growth in our economy, in GDP. And then this is just a quick graph that shows the growth rates of oil, energy, and GDP. And I just put it here to show like how deeply correlated these different variables are, which, yeah, it's quite interesting, like how similar the curves are. And it just shows how intertwined fossil fuels are with our economy. So there are a few reasons why fossil fuels have enabled such immense growth. First of all, before fossil fuels, energy mostly came from human or animal muscle power, as well as water power, so such as being used through water mills. And this allowed humans to have some control over the means of production, it allowed workers to have some control over the means of production because they were able to do work using their own energy. But by replacing muscle power with fossil power, only the elite could access the resources needed to produce energy. This weakened workers' bargaining power and enabled capitalists to better concentrate control over the means of production in order to accumulate wealth. Secondly, fossil fuels have unique physical properties that are very advantageous, such as a high energy density compared to previous fuels that were used, like biofuels. And they're also independent from natural cycles. So they can be used at any time of the day or the year, unlike the sun or the wind. This also allowed a massive increase in economic output. Third, fossil fuels are very mobile. They can be transported around the world. They can be concentrated in certain areas. And this is a lot harder to do with the previous types of energy that were used. So this property enabled the transportation of commodities around the world, leading to the economy of mass consumption that we have now. And it also enabled the concentration of industry in urban areas so that capitalists could amass a large supply of surplus workers. In summary, fossil fuels were conducive to creating the specific conditions needed for capital accumulation and exponential growth. Without them, we probably wouldn't have this obsession with growth because our economy simply couldn't sustain it. And so this speaks to me a lot about how transitioning to renewable energy could actually, in turn, be conducive to building a more localized, distributed economy in tune with natural cycles. But back to fossil fuels for now. It's not just that fossil fuels have been necessary for growth. Growth is also necessary for the fossil fuel industry. It's an industry based on never-ending extraction. If we stop growing our economies and end mass consumption, we don't need fossil fuels. In fact, fossil fuel companies always make their case for continued extraction amidst the climate crisis by citing projected energy demand numbers, always saying that the world needs more energy, as if it's inevitable that energy demand will be at a certain level in, say, 2040. Further, a key metric that's used to assess fossil fuel companies is the reserve replacement ratio. This is the ratio of new reserves to reserves that have been used in any given year. And fossil fuel companies need a reserve replacement ratio of at least 100% to show investors that they are a good investment. In other words, for all the reserves they use, they need to find an equivalent amount to replace it. And thus that means they need to be constantly growing. Fossil fuel companies don't want to stop exploring for new reserves, let alone write off the reserves that they already have. And so for all of these reasons, the fossil fuel industry is ardently committed to advancing a growth agenda. And they will do everything in their power to do so. And unfortunately, the fossil fuel industry has a lot of power. So this is a little schematic that I got from Carroll et al. That just shows the different spheres of power the fossil fuel industry has. So just to quickly go over this, the one on the left is economic power. So this is based on the amount of capital that a company has and its ability to exert influence over the market, to make investments, kick people off their land, etc., in order to carry out their accumulation strategy. The fossil fuel industry has a lot of economic power because they've amassed so much capital over the years, and it's been concentrated within a small number of companies. The second is political power. So this is the power of industry to influence legislation and policy through things like lobbying, regulatory capture, the revolving door, political donations, etc. We know this is very strong for the fossil fuel industry and why we haven't seen climate action for so many decades. And it's also especially strong because the fossil fuel industry works together with other elites, such as those from the financial sector and other industries, to consolidate their power and make sure the government prioritizes their interests. And then we have civil society. So this refers to industry's ability to influence the public and our culture through funding things like education and research, through advertising, influencing the media, etc. And so for the fossil fuel industry, this is their ability to mislead the public on climate science and climate solutions. And together, political influence plus cultural influence allows the industry to achieve hegemony, which basically just means the ability to influence our societal values or what is considered common sense. And because the fossil fuel industry has hegemonic power in our society, they've been able to set the common sense narrative about growth. And that's what brings us back to growth and degrowth. But this is why you'll often hear things like, we need growth, we need economic growth in order for everyone to have a good job and enough money to live. And so it's this narrative that growth is necessary for everyone, even though it's just really at the end of the day benefiting a small number of elites. Or you'll hear things like protecting the environment and growing the economy must go hand in hand, which is something we hear a lot in Canada. So yeah, just to bring us back to divestment and to wrap up this section, the goal of divestment is specifically to address this problem of fossil fuel hegemony, to break down the fossil fuel industry's ability to set the narrative, to influence the public and influence politicians. And this work is really crucial because for the reasons I've laid out, as long as the fossil fuel industry is able to set that agenda, we will not be able to achieve degrowth. And with that, I will pass it on to Guy to talk about some of the limits and why divestment isn't enough, but we also need to go beyond it.
Yeah, thanks. So to recap, both divestment and degrowth are pretty dope. While not entirely aligned, they both work towards resisting the fossil fuel-based extractivist growth model by directly severing the ties between production and social license. The wave of divestment has been explicitly mentioned as posing a material risk to continued business in reports by Shell. And you know, every day we get new news that it seems to be working. However, divestment doesn't holistically interrogate the growth model itself. It still acts within a framework of endowment fund growth that simply says, no, we won't really change what we're doing, but we can at least change who we're doing it with and stop doing it with the fossil fuel companies. So while positive for addressing climate change and financial climate risks, this risks a switch from Suncor and Chevron to the Tesla and Apples of the world, which are really not that much better. Because endowment funds and the fiduciary responsibility inherent to their governance requires solid financial returns, and because of the still somewhat nascent range of established alternatives, this poses problems. So on the next slide, you'll see if you search up responsible investment funds or clean or low carbon ETFs right now, chances are you'll see some combination of Apple, Tesla, Amazon, or even something like Airbnb listed within the top 10 assets and representing a decent chunk of the investment fund. So the divestment of fossil fuels usually implies a switch to high tech or green tech alternatives, which, as you can see, is quite problematic. I have this table here, and we maybe don't need to spend too much time on it, but even something that heavily favors Tesla over Chevron doesn't necessarily imply that it doesn't have its own neocolonial issues or its own labor issues. And just quickly on EVs in general, like out of the whole range of sustainable transportation options, those are kind of the worst. Especially during a pandemic when the one person who has the most shares of that company got billions of dollars. Imagine what we could have done if that money went to high-speed rail networks across North America, which we sorely lack. So Apple, Amazon, usually a lot of high-tech companies also engage in very problematic either resource extraction, they have issues with privacy, they have big issues with labor, and are generally not really something that we want our universities to be proud of owning. In the next slide, you'll see that another issue with this is kind of the stock market in general. So especially in Canada, as an example, where a huge chunk of the TSX or the Toronto Stock Exchange is effectively either resource extraction or the financial sector, which itself is heavily invested in resource extraction. For large endowment funds, it's tough to have sizable, better options, which kind of limits us in what we're able to invest in if we stick to, the same sort of economic growth model that needs endowment funds to keep growing. The TSX has, I think it's together, fossil fuels and banks account to almost 40% of the TSX, I believe. And RBC, Scotiabank, CIBC, BMO, and TD, which are our 5 biggest banks in Canada, have together spent over $200 billion on fossil fuels since Paris and continue to fund neocolonial projects such as Line 3. So as you see, the lack of interrogation of the capital accumulation dismisses the wide range of alternative possibilities like investing in local food systems, community energy ownership, and democracy, or affordable housing. With that, I'll pass it off to Evelyn.
Yeah, so as Guy pointed out, divestment doesn't holistically interrogate the growth model itself and still acts within the framework of an endowment fund's growth. So looking specifically at endowment funds within universities, in recent decades, the growth of endowment funds have accelerated rapidly due to transitions in the way that funds are invested over the last 50 years or so. And in recent decades, endowment growth tends to far exceed expenditures. So this slide is drawing primarily from an article from the American Economic Review by Jeffrey Brown et al. And the data that they use comes from the National Association of College and University Business Officers, as well as data from the National Center of Education and Statistics from the US Department of Education. So it's very US focused. So in theory, endowment fund payouts can be adjusted to compensate for shocks. So are there a positive shock or a negative shock? So a negative shock would be like COVID-19 causing a recession in the economy, and a positive shock would be a year when there's a stimulus in the economy and returns are higher than usual. And so endowments are, in theory, payouts are made to kind of adjust for this fluctuation. And usually how this is done is there's like a fixed percentage of the endowment that's paid out based on the average size of the endowment over the past 3 years. So maybe 5% is paid out of the average of the last 3 years. However, in practice, what's often observed is that in response to positive shocks, payouts are left unchanged, but in response to negative shocks, universities tend to actively reduce payouts. So this differs from the predicted models and has been called endowment hoarding, where, quote, endowments are seen as an objective in its own right, rather than simply a means to an end. And it's also been speculated that these payouts tend to be limited even in times of economic hardship, because universities see endowment size as a symbol of status and prestige, and it tends to sort of reflect on the status of the current president. So even when the amount of the endowment is large, the scope is limited and it lacks a structure for mutual aid and relief during times of hardship like the pandemic. Next slide. So to push back on this growth, so the question is, if the objective remains to grow the endowment, how do we kind of reconcile divestment and degrowth within this framework if the result is likely to be a push for green growth and tech, which has its own problems as outlined in previous slides? So I think it's important to note that endowments come from systems that prioritize private wealth. So endowed funds tend to come from wealthy benefactors and grow through their returns. So it's very much dependent on a system where we can rely on a few wealthy benefactors to give donations. And so an example of this is that if we look at the global landscape, we'll find that Harvard's endowment alone is 3 times that of the total size of Canadian schools' endowments. But if we look at the top 3 Canadian schools, they're likely in the top 3 endowments throughout the world outside of the US, with the exclusion of the UK. And endowments across continental Europe tend to be few and far between. And the major difference here is that European schools tend to be given significantly more public funding, so there isn't as much need to rely on private donations of endowed funds. So what we require is, on a large scale, a shift away from private fundraising and an increase to public funding through sort of a greater redistribution of wealth amongst the general public. Next slide. Now this is something, sort of this switch from private fundraising to increased public funding is something that's largely out of our control as student divestment organizers in a lot of ways. So what can we do? And the answer is that we can recognize that divestment alone is not enough. It's a contribution to a long-term goal. So what we can do is maintain community reinvestment demands alongside our divestment demands, and specifically push universities for community reinvestment and to invest in community loan funds, public banks, credit unions, and things like this, in addition to divestment. So when the Divest Canada Coalition launched its inaugural open letter in September 2020, our listed demands were divest from the past, reject false solutions, and invest in the future, keeping divestment and reinvestment in equal footing to one another, and recognizing that we can't only phase out our worst investments, we have to actively pursue a regenerative economy. So next slide. So traditional investment practices tend to consider 2 things, risk and return, and both are about money, with the goal of using money to make more money over time. In addition to removing power from the fossil fuel industry, divestment helps to spark a conversation about our economic system and its priorities, and divestment challenges the hegemony of investing practices by asking us to consider other values and consider the impact that our investments make on society. So impact investing can act as a kind of community reinvestment, and it's an alternative model to traditional investing that asset managers generally pursue. And we'll talk probably more about this in the next couple of presentations that are coming up, and I know we're kind of getting close to time here. But in general, it's a kind of investing that sort of prioritizes the social well-being and the impact that an investment makes on a community over the returns that are generated from that investment. So these are just a couple of principles that we took from the transformative investment principles by resource generation. So they call for redefining impact investing to mean investing in those most impacted by injustices and trusting their leaderships. Redefine return to mean returning to the right relationship to people and planet. And redefining risk to make visible those who've been placed at risk in order to accumulate wealth for wealthy investors. So through divestment organizing, we're able to build a community of young people who have committed to this fight for the long haul and are questioning systems and structures of power around us. And now that we understand the system, we can also work together to build alternatives. So next slide. So one quick example that I wanted to point to before we wrap up here is Seed Commons. So Seed Commons is a community loan fund that could act as a form of impact investing. Seed Commons is a national network of locally rooted non-extractive loan funds that brings together the power of big finance under community control. And it's sort of a prime example of the way that we can slow growth to improve communities. So just a bit taken from their website, Seed Common channels investments to marginalized communities that have faced the brunt of an extractive economy, deindustrialization, systemic discrimination, making community-controlled finance available to cooperatively owned businesses that create jobs, build wealth, and challenge inequality. So they generally invest in community cooperatives rather than private businesses to further encourage circulation of wealth within communities. And in principle, they follow non-extractive lending practices where the cost of capital is always less than or equal to 50% of the resulting profits for the cooperatives. So this means that, or this ensures that recipients of the loans don't go into debt trying to pay it back, and they don't have to pay back more than they earned as a result of the investment. So in this way, community reinvestment funds may not consistently generate as high returns, but they do generate better social well-being and uplift communities. And reinvestment in this way kind of pushes back on the growth paradigm, and we see a link between sort of slower economic growth for investors, but higher social and community wellness. So I guess next slide. So in conclusion, I think there's kind of a long way to go, but divestment sparks a larger conversation and drives us in the direction of degrowth. So it's just something to be mindful of, that we're always working within a larger system and there's a lot more work to be done. And we have to kind of pursue these mechanisms of degrowth to sort of fundamentally rethink our economy, sort of outside of just sort of divestment organizing. So I think that kind of wraps up for us. So if there were questions from anybody, we're happy to like answer some of those. Yeah.
Yeah, also, I guess feel free to drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
Thanks for the positive feedback, everyone.
All right, maybe we should make our way up.
So the question is, I'm curious if any of you have pushed against the growth paradigm explicitly in your divestment campaigns.
Michelle?
Anyone? I don't think we have. Rachel, are you here? I think Rachel might be talking about that more in her presentation.
I can also speak to that pretty quickly too, because Zahur also, I think McGill's recent motion to divest from like the whole range of human rights abuse companies was a really good step in that direction. And in a recent meeting with at UW with our investment committee, I brought up the idea of, or I brought up what McGill was doing and said that we should maybe divest from Enbridge, like whether or not their ESG rates are good, because they recently had those workers arrested in Minnesota working on Line 3. And they kind of didn't really have a way to respond to it. And they kind of just viewed that as an ethical consideration, which like didn't really hold any weight in the conversation. So I think we still have some ways to go to be able to bring like a non-profit focused consideration to this work.
Yeah, I think it also might like require us partnering with campaigns for like free public college or free university, because yeah, like as long as universities are going to be relying on these systems of finance that are based on never-ending growth, we're going to constantly be coming up with these problems around what to invest in. So yeah, I think it requires like an alternative funding model for our universities, which is obviously a big project, but I think it's like definitely an opportunity for solidarity and alignment with other folks that are already working on this. Any other questions? I know folks might want to jump off for a little break before the next session, but I think we can stay around for a few more minutes if folks have more questions. We also have a degrowth reading group where if you were interested in this presentation, you want to discuss these things more and dive into readings. I don't know if somebody can drop the Discord link to that. Oh, thank you, Mary. That was fast. Yeah, we'd welcome you to join. Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, we'll have our next meeting a week from today.
Yeah, I would also plug the upcoming CANSI conference, but I cannot find the 2021. Yeah, there's also a conference on ecological economics, which does end up featuring a lot of degrowth literature and research and work. And it's a pretty cool, rad network. Here it is. So I would also recommend, if you have the time.
Yeah, we'll be doing a little problem thing there. Right. Cool. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us.
That really flew by.
I know. I'm sorry, Evelyn, you were like.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, we had a lot. Yeah, 45 minutes was pretty tight.
Yeah. Zahur, here's still. Are you ready for ours?
Yeah, I was ready to talk it, I guess.
Yep.
All right, should we hop off onto that then?
Yeah.
All right, see you everyone. Thanks. This was great.
Bye.
Bye.